morning, or perhaps more accurately, happy noontide. My name is Margaret Farley, and on behalf of our Yale Divinity School Dean, Harold Attridge, I'm delighted and privileged to welcome you to this very significant occasion, the first annual Arthur W. Galston Memorial Lecture. Dean Attridge, who has been very much involved in the planning and preparation for this event, was unfortunately at the last minute not able to be here. I extend this welcome also on behalf of Yale's Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics and the Department of Molecular, Cellular, and Developing Biology, as well as the Joseph P. Slifka Center for Jewish Life at Yale. I want to welcome especially members of Arthur Galston's family who are here with us today, and of course our esteemed speaker, Bill McKibben. Yale University has always been characterized by what some of us have named permeable boundaries between and among its departments, schools, and centers. These have allowed extraordinary interdisciplinary work to be done. And those of us associated in particular with the Bioethics Center have on a major scale experienced the shared scholarly life and work that are part of the university's mission and commitment. Arthur Galston was a central figure among the founding faculty of the Bioethics Center, and we honor him today even as we share in the ongoing fruits of his own interdisciplinary work. So thank you for joining us, and we begin by turning to Professor Mary Helen Goldsmith, who will share with us her reflections regarding Professor Galston.
Thank you, Margaret. We have just lived through 8 years of perverse disdain for science at the highest levels of government, and we now witness an overwhelming collision of economic and ecological crises. This is thus an appropriate time to remember Art Galston's belief in the responsibilities of scientists as citizens, and we are so happy to be able to welcome his son, Bill Galston, and his daughter, Beth Galston. Art acted on his beliefs. Early in his career, he observed that high concentrations of a synthetic growth regulator defoliated soybeans. When in 1962, the United States military began massive, widespread aerial spraying with related compounds to defoliate the Vietnamese countryside, Art became concerned about the possible ecological damage to rainforests and mangrove swamps, as well as poisoning of civilians, their crops, domesticated animals, either directly or through their water supplies. Art and a small number of fellow citizens brought persistent pressure on the White House until President Nixon finally banned spraying in 1970, 5 years before the war ended. Only later did it emerge that the herbicide was contaminated with dioxin, a known carcinogen. In 1971, Art spent 3 weeks in South and North Vietnam assessing the aftermath of the spraying. During the 70s, Art created a course in bioethics at Yale well before the importance of discussing ethical issues raised by new medical and agricultural technologies was generally appreciated. What started as a college seminar with 18 students grew to one of the largest courses in Yale College. He personally prepared his teaching assistants to handle the sensitive issues from stem cell research and bioengineering to transgenic crops. Art retired at age 70, and with his customary dedication, he continued teaching this course for another 16 years. Art was also the prime mover, as you've heard, in organizing faculty seminars on bioethics and policy. The author and Dale Galston lecture series in environmental ethics brought to campus experts on a wide variety of issues. Responding to the emerging controversy over the safety of transgenic crops, an ongoing forum on genetically modified plants engages the faculty, students, and local school teachers in exploring both the biological implications and promise of transgenic plants. And throughout it all, Art continued to write extensively on bioethics and public policy. Among his many honors, Art was perhaps the most pleased by the William Clyde Devane Medal presented by the Yale chapter of Phi Beta Kappa for distinguished lifelong teaching and scholarship. Art's words from his 1979 article, Herbicides, a Mixed Blessing, still has salience today as we face today's environmental problems, and they are a fitting close to my remarks. I believe it is the social responsibility of scientists to consider the bad with the good and help the lay public to attain a balanced view of this question, and elected officials to frame appropriate regulatory legislation. It is no more socially acceptable for herbicide scientists and the chemical industry to react emotionally and defensively towards valid criticisms of their products that they have developed than it is for citizens groups to damn all artificial chemicals indiscriminately. Even authoritative writers barely mention the negative aspects and promulgate only part of the truth, which serves neither science nor society optimally.
I'm Steve Latham. I'm the Deputy Director of the Bioethics Center, and it is my happy duty to introduce our main speaker to you. I will not give a standard introduction for Bill McKibben. You can read in your program about his dozen wonderful books, his well-deserved prizes, his honorary degrees, his current work at Middlebury. I'll instead try to say something briefly about what makes Bill's work so special. In his edited collection of American environmental writing, American Earth, a great collection, by the way, which everyone here should purchase and read, Bill uses a lovely phrase to distinguish environmental writing from mere nature writing. Environmental writing, Bill says, takes as its topic the collision between people and the rest of the world. There in germ is the core of Bill's writing, but Bill is not content simply to chart the devastating effects of that collision on the natural world that he loves. Of course, he does that very well, but he also thinks and writes, importantly, about the deeply mistaken world view that makes us insist on colliding with our world rather than dwelling contentedly within it. Our arrogance, our consumerism, our distracted inattention to nature, the attitude of technological dominance that we bring to bear not only on our surroundings but even on our own bodies. These traits of ours are as much Bill's concern as the environmental devastation that they cause. It could be depressing, and it would be if Bill weren't also so obviously, irrationally, impossibly full of hope. Let me tell you a story. 31 years ago, this month, April, Bill McKibben decided to go to Harvard. He decided on Harvard because when he came there for a visit, he found 3,500 students marching through Harvard Yard with candles, protesting the university's involvement in South Africa. Here were some people who were realistic enough to see that things were wrong with the world and hopeful enough to do what they could to change them. That was the sort of person Bill wanted to be and the kind of student body that he wanted to join. Well, his Harvard classmates, and I was one of them, we disappointed Bill During our 4 years at Harvard, there was no demonstration of comparable size to the one that Bill had witnessed the spring before his enrollment. Bill devoted his parting editorial as president of the Harvard Crimson to reflection on why we were so oddly quiet in the face of a world full of problems, and why it might be worthwhile to take action and to protest and to hope, even against all odds. Well, fast forward a few decades to a different April of 2007. With 6 college students, Bill organized 1,400 simultaneous global warming demonstrations across all 50 states in America, the largest day of protest about climate change in the nation's history. How about that, class of '82? My point is this. Bill spreads bad news effectively. But he spreads hope effectively, too. He sobers and inspires. That combination is his gift. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored and very pleased to give you the first Arthur W. Galston Lecturer, Bill McKibben.
Well, thank you, Steve, old friend. That was a very kind introduction, and it's what a privilege for me to get to be here and in this beautiful space. Now, it's a little dangerous to let me in the pulpit, I must say. I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher in backwoods Methodist church. Several of them would fit in this nice building, and you don't have to. The theological training is minimal, it must be said. If one's capable of taking a tea towel on Christmas Eve and turning a 4th grader into a Palestinian shepherd, then you're pretty much, that's about all the qualifications you need. But Sunday school teachers, spend much of their time down in the basement while all the good stuff's going on upstairs. So I think we suffer from a kind of pulpit envy in a way. And the point of which is I may be here for a while, okay? It's a tremendous honor, most of all, to be giving this first lecture in honor of Professor Galston. One of those people because of whom the world is palpably different than it would have been otherwise, which is not something that can be said of all or most people, and a very profound thing indeed to be able to say. And it's a pleasure for me because his work and this sort of almost historical accidents that it wandered into coincide nicely with much of the things, many of the topics that I work on. Sometime around 50 years ago, with Rachel Carson and then with all that followed in its wake, we began to wake up to the idea that perhaps progress wasn't quite as perfectly shiny as we had heretofore thought it would be, that modernity was tainted in certain ways, and that we were going to have to take that taint into considerable calculation as we move forward. So, with Rachel Carson, or then with the understanding of things like Agent Orange, with the very, fact of our misadventure in Vietnam ramified on into our following subsequent misadventures around the world, with the advent of our ability to genetically manipulate organisms before we'd evolved any particular sense about where or when that might be appropriate, to make no mistake about it, the very related set of financial failures that we now see dominating our headlines for the moment. In a sense, much of the enterprise of modernity is called into more and more serious question by this chain of events. And most of all, as I will spend most of this talk describing, by the almost inconceivable crisis now breaking over our heads because of the changes in the temperature of the planet. All these things, in a sense, share a common theme. And it's in some ways appropriate that we're here today to talk about it because in a way it's an almost theological theme, this idea that in very short order in the lifetimes of people in this room, humans have gotten very, very big all of a sudden, extremely big, able to cast a very long shadow, and we've gotten big too fast before we could figure out what the consequences of that were going to be. Maybe since we're in church, you'll forgive me if I appeal for a moment to my favorite book in the Bible, book of Job in the Hebrew Bible. One of the first great modern stories, in a sense, because it's ambiguous, but it's also one of the first great piece of nature writing in the Western tradition, and perhaps the most beautiful of all. You all know the story, of course. Job is a fine fellow, and he's suddenly, inexplicably cursed, and his flocks die, and his family dies, and he finds himself living on a dung heap at the edge of town, covered with oozing sores. Things are not going well in his world, and contrary to the patient Job of legend, he's in fact much the opposite, very impatient and very demanding, and keeps insisting that God appear to explain why this has happened to him. You know, give me some justification. Friends keep saying, oh, no, you sinned or your children sinned. No. You know, the conventional wisdom today is not good enough to explain this turn of events. I want God to appear and tell me, justify himself. This turns out to fall into the category of be careful what you wish for, in a way, because God does appear, and speaking out of the voice of a whirlwind, delivers a long soliloquy. Now, there are actual theologians here, so somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's the longest speech that God gives anywhere in the Bible, Old Testament or New, okay? And unbelievably beautiful. It's a sort of tour of the physical universe and of all the wild creatures that there could be, and very biologically accurate and sexy and crunchy and just magnificent piece of writing. I particularly recommend the Stephen Mitchell translation that North Point Press published some years ago. A magnificent piece of writing. But it's also unbelievably sarcastic. Okay, it's a taunt. God keeps saying, "Who are you? You know, if you're so smart, do you know where I keep the storms? Can you whistle up a hurricane? You know, do you tell the proud waves where to break?" This just goes on and on and on. Very sarcastic and quite powerful, since it's God talking to you. You know, taunting. At a certain point, Job just basically says, "Sorry I asked," you know, and sits down, and that's and more or less that's been the relationship of human beings to the natural world for most of our career. We're been a small part of something very large, and as God explains in this soliloquy, quite beautiful and orderly and meaningful and mysterious and cruel and magnificent. Okay. We don't get to say what Job says, you know. We don't get to just sit down. We get to answer right back because we're big now. Okay? We're extremely large. And the best proof of that largeness is, well, the first proof of that largeness, of course, was 60 years ago with the ability to contemplate all-out nuclear war and what that would mean for the planet. But we've averted that so far. The best proof of it in real time is the ongoing climate saga now unfolding. I wrote the first book for a general audience about global warming 20 years ago. At the time, it was still a hypothesis. I thought a very strong one, The science was very clear, okay? The molecular structure of CO2 we know enough about to know that it traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. Since we were burning enough coal and gas and oil to put lots of CO2 into the atmosphere, it seemed in many ways quite clear what the outcome would be, but it also seemed emotionally counterintuitive. How could we have gotten large enough to be affecting everything that happened on the surface of the Earth? Because that's what we're talking about, every process that we see. Evaporation, precipitation, wind speed, progress of the seasons, on and on and on, draws its energy from that increment of the sun's energy trapped in our narrow envelope of atmosphere. The only exceptions are tectonic and volcanic forces. Everything else on the surface comes from the sun. Well, to kind of get over that sort of impossibility factor, science went to work, and went to work with more diligence and more money and more resources than really had ever tackled any similar-sized problem in a similar period of time. Incredibly powerful body of work. And of course, the point of that work, the scientific dialectic being what it is, was to prove that the hypothesis was wrong, to take down this idea. By 1995, it was very clear that that wasn't going to happen, and that a strong consensus had emerged within the community that climate change was very real and very serious. It was a kind of wake-up call. You are that big, and now we're going to have to deal with consequences. The time since 1995, it's as if the planet itself has been peer-reviewing that research just to make sure that it was correct, okay? We've had all 10 of the warmest years on record since then. And it's become abundantly clear that this hypothesis is completely true. Y'all are completely up to date on that part of the story, I know. Maybe, I just want to extend for a minute here just to sort of bring you right to where we are at the moment. Because in the last couple of years, 18 months, that hypothesis that turned to consensus has actually turned again to a kind of panic. As we begin to understand that these changes are happening on a larger scale and much more quickly than we had anticipated. Okay? The signal event in this realization was probably the rapid melt of Arctic ice in the summer of 2007. Ice has been melting steadily for 40 years, but only by 1 or 2% on average a year, okay, the minimum extent of ice increasing. Summer '07, it just fell off a cliff. By the time the long Arctic night descended in September and ice began to reform, there was 25% less than there'd ever been before. That was repeated last summer. For a while last summer, both the northwest and northeast passages were wide open. You could circumnavigate the Arctic on open water. Never happened in human history, and long before human history. Now that's scary because it's proof that we're warming the planet. There's no other explanation for what's going on. But it's also scary because it reminds us that this is a process that can get easily completely out of control, that there are feedback loops embedded in the system that are very dangerous. So that nice white ice sheet across the Arctic reflects 80% of incoming solar radiation back out to space. Okay? It's a mirror, a useful thing in this case. You remove it and replace it with blue water, that absorbs 80% of that incoming radiation. This heat, scientists would call it Arctic amplification, is now well underway, and the heat signal stretches 1,500 kilometers inland from the ocean now, and one of the results of that is that we're seeing very rapid rise in the melt rate of the tundra, the permafrost. And it turns out that trapped beneath that permafrost, there's another global warming gas, methane, CH4, that's suddenly spiking in the atmosphere in very large quantities. Scientists who in the last 2 years have been describing Siberia, the coldest place in the northern hemisphere, pointing out that even at 40 below, ponds and streams and things aren't freezing because there's so much methane bubbling out from beneath that it's keeping them open as the year goes along. Those are scary because it adds to the volume of heat-trapping gas in the atmosphere, but what's scary really about it is that at a certain point, we're not directly doing it. We create the conditions by burning coal and gas and oil and putting carbon in the atmosphere to set off these chain of reactions, but past a certain point, we're not in control of it anymore. So that even if we did everything right and stopped burning that coal and gas and oil very quickly, it's by now an open question as to how long that melt will continue and what whether or not we'll be able to rein this system back in. We have a number, finally, to express this, and this is this most important number in the world that I've been describing. It came from our foremost climatologists, NASA team, in January of 2008, led by Jim Hansen. They published a paper in which they said that 350 parts per million CO2 was the most that we could have in the atmosphere for any long period of time if we wished to retain, as they put it in the abstract of a peer-reviewed scientific paper, if we wish to maintain a planet similar to the one on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. Okay? So 350 is a new number. Nobody knew it, even 18 months ago. And it's a really important number. It turns out to be one of those fundamental things about the Earth that's worth knowing, in sort of the same way that it's worth knowing that the proper temperature of your body is 98.6 or something like that, so you have some baseline against which to judge. Before the Industrial Revolution, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 was 275 parts per million, plus or minus 10 parts per million for 10,000 years. Okay? And this stability in the atmosphere underwrote the climatic stability that has marked human civilization, that 10,000 years of the Holocene. It's been remarkably stable time and a good one to be building the kind of scale of civilization that we've built. We began to raise that number above 275 with the Industrial Revolution. We began to pour carbon into the atmosphere, but we never knew where the red line was, right? We didn't know exactly where the danger... This was a big experiment in sort of the same way that, introducing defoliants into the biosphere was an experiment. We didn't know where the red line was, okay? In fact, at first, the number we tossed around 20 years ago a lot was 550 parts per million. Because we had any real idea that this was the danger point? No, because it was twice what it used to be, and hence relatively easy to model on a computer, okay? And with the way that sort of things like that, I can show you lots of charts with people had drawn red lines at 500. We began to understand that was too high. Finally, now we have this real number to work with. The trouble is, it's one hell of a tough number, okay? We're already past it. We're at 387 parts per million and rising 2 parts per million per annum at the moment. We're not like the guy who goes to the doctor and the doctor says, if you keep up this cheese-eating habit of yours, someday your cholesterol will be too high, We're like the guy who goes to the doctor and the doctor says, look, we're going to have a talk right now. Your cholesterol is too high, and if it stays in this zone, as long as it's in this zone, your chance of having a heart attack or a stroke is really good, and you better hope you can get it down before that heart attack or stroke happens. Well, that's where we are as a planet, and those heart attacks and strokes are starting to happen. That's why the Arctic is melting, okay? And it's why lots and lots of other things are going on. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold air does, a useful fact to keep in mind. It means that in every arid place around the world, we're seeing remarkable increases in evaporation and hence in drought, and drought on an epic scale. In fact, the Australian Meteorological Office said a few weeks ago that they're no longer going to use the term drought to describe what's going on because, as they put it, drought implies that it may come to an end at some point, okay? It clearly, from what they can tell, isn't. The tropics, the meteorological tropics, have expanded in the last 15 years about 2 degrees north and 2 degrees south, okay? And that's pushed the dry subtropics that much further out, north and south, and now that accounts for some of that dryness across that continent. And not just Australia. The U.S. government has said much the same thing about the American Southwest. In fact, Most hydrologists now think that Lake Powell, the great huge lake formed behind Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado River, will never fill again. That is, that the rate of evaporation is now high enough and the rate of virgin stream flow on the upper Colorado low enough that it'll just slowly sink over time, and within 10 or 15 years may be entirely empty. Once that water's up in the air, it's going to come down someplace. And that's what's happening in every wet place in the world. Tremendous deluge and flood. At this latitude, we see about a 25% increase in the number of storms that drop 2 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. The kind of gully washers that do nobody any good, that make it very hard to farm, that, you know, on and on and on. We see big changes in storminess. I'm going to be in New Orleans tomorrow at Tulane talking with people who have, you know, dealt firsthand with the consequences of what it means when you begin to amp up these systems. Hurricanes draw their power from the heat in the first few meters of the sea's surface. And we are now seeing, we think, more and definitely more intense hurricanes than we've seen in the past. Okay? So 350 is an incredibly important number, the most important number we have. Badisha, would you pass that sign? As you'll see in a minute, I'm trying to learn to be an organizer of sorts. I'm very bad at it, but there's a sign-up sheet going around that if you want to be informed and help in this work that I'm going to be describing, I hope you'll give us your name and email address. It would be very useful. The point I'm trying to make is that this is no longer a question for people's children or grandchildren, okay? And it's no longer some abstract threat that's coming at us someday. This is what's happening here and now. It's not abstract. Just the same way that once those discoveries about defoliants in soybeans turned into Agent Orange, there was suddenly no abstraction about them, and one had to go take action and make something happen. So now, for me, that moment of just sort of snapping, came in a trip to Bangladesh. There are probably people here who've been to Bangladesh. It's one of the most beautiful countries on earth, incredibly fertile, a very tolerant and wonderful Muslim culture. One of my favorite places on earth. Very crowded, 140 million people in an area the size of Wisconsin, but it feeds itself. It's food self-sufficient because the great sacred rivers of Asia, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, come pouring down out of the Himalayas, and they flood gently out over this delta and leave behind every year and leave behind a layer of silt, and things just explode out of the ground so they can feed themselves. But they're completely screwed. Okay? Those rivers come out of the glaciers high in the Himalayas. There's an area the size of Italy up in Tibet where glaciers form the headwaters of the Yangtze, the Yellow, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Mekong, and the Salween. Those glaciers are melting fast, and many of them may be gone by mid-century. Okay? 1/3 of human beings live downstream from those glaciers. And they don't just live there by accident. That's why they live there. One of the great features of the Holocene was that it was warm enough that there wasn't a sheet of ice above the continental interiors and we could grow grain, but it was cold enough that there was this permanent snowpack in the Andes, in the Himalayas, in the Sierras. Okay? There's no plan B for what happens down below, when those melt. Meanwhile, the Bay of Bengal is rising and will rise much more. Another useful physical principle to keep in mind is that warm water takes up more space than cold. That alone will be enough, that thermal expansion, to raise the sea level a couple of feet this century. And we now think it's going to be considerably higher than that because it looks like Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheets are not as stable as we'd assumed them to be even a few years ago. People are now tossing around numbers like 5, 6, 7 feet of sea level rise in the course of this century. Those are civilization-challenging numbers, and no place more obvious than along the Bay of Bengal. But those are relatively chronic problems. When I was there, they were suffering from a very acute problem. They were having their first big outbreak of a disease called dengue fever. All right? a mosquito-borne disease that the World Health Organization says will be the emergent disease of this century, because the mosquito that spreads it, Aedes aegypti, is remarkably sensitive to changes in heat and humidity and expands its range rapidly. And indeed, we've seen increases in incidence of 200, 300, 400% across South America and Asia so far this decade. Last year in Brazil, they had an outbreak so bad that the military was opening field hospitals across the interior because emergency rooms were reporting 400 cases an hour arriving at their doors. Okay? This having their first big outbreak in Dhaka, the city in Bangladesh of 14 million, when I was there. And I was spending a lot of time in the slums, so I got bit by the wrong mosquito and I came down with dengue myself, all right? Well, obviously I didn't die. A lot of people did die. They were younger than me or older than me or sicker than me or poorer than me to begin with, and so not able to deal with this. I remember going to the hospital in Dhaka. Big ward, cots stretching as far as you can see, people lying on each cot shivering. This is a nasty disease. They call it breakbone fever. It's unpleasant in the extreme. And of course, it has those, sweats and then chills. People just, and there's people on the floor between the cots because there aren't enough cots. I remember in between shivers myself, sitting there thinking, these people have done nothing to deserve this. When the UN tries to measure how much carbon each country in the world emits, you can't get a number for Bangladesh. It's a rounding error in the calculation. They travel by bicycle, rickshaw. Most people aren't connected to the electric grid, The 4% of us who live in this country use 25% of the world's CO2. This is not perfect epidemiology, but perhaps as moral mathematics, it therefore works to say that 1 bed in 4 in that hospital is on us, And perhaps this sort of Sunday school teacher part of me moves from that to say that far from loving our neighbors as we have been called to do, we're engaged in the act of sickening, drowning, and otherwise making life impossible for our neighbors around the world with enormous speed. At any rate, when I came back from Bangladesh, something in me had snapped. After almost 20 years of speaking and writing about this, I wanted to do something more than that. Because nothing had changed in this country. We literally no federal policy of any kind to address the largest issue that had ever come down the pike. Okay. But I had no idea what I was doing. As you can tell, I still have little idea of it. But I'm a writer. I live up in the woods in Vermont, Writers are people who self-select for, wanting to sit inside and type, okay? We're sort of socially ill at ease and poor at, I had no idea really what to do. My great plan, I called up a few of my other writer friends and said, look, let's go up, we have to do something. Let's go up to Burlington, our main city, and we'll sit in on the steps of the federal building and we'll be arrested and there'll be a little story in the paper and at least we will have done something. And all these other guys are as completely clueless as me. Oh, okay, that sounds like a good plan, But happily, one of them calls up to the police in Burlington. What happens if the police said, nothing happens, stay there as long as you want. We'll come visit, okay. Well, we have to, So we had to recalibrate. So I started sending out emails to people. Just say, we're going to go on a walk, come join us. And 3 weeks later, we leave on this walk. And we left from Robert Frost's old summer riding cabin in the Green Mountains, because he's sort of our patron saint in Vermont, and because, we like that most cliched of all high school English class poems about the road not taken. It seemed quite apropos to the situation. So off we go, and we're walking for 5 days, and we're sleeping in farmers' fields along the way, and I've phoned up the kind of Methodist mafia, so we're having meetings in churches in the evening and stuff, and it's all good. We get to Burlington, there's 1,000 people marching. Now, here's the part that I have to explain. Okay, in Vermont, 1,000 people is an almost unbelievable number of people, okay? Maybe at UVM hockey games you get that. That's it. Okay, cows were bolting in terror from the fence line as we came by, It was for Vermont, an impressive sight, and more than enough to get all our candidates for office. This was fall 2006, to come down and meet with us, a rally on the shore of Lake Champlain. And not just to meet with us, they all signed on to this piece of raggedy cardboard that we'd been carrying across the countryside saying, if I'm elected, I'll work to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2050. Which at the time, extremely radical position. The only people who held it were scientists, okay? Politicians, no, but much too much. But, okay. But they all signed, and not just, I mean, we were pretty sure that Bernie Sanders was going to sign, you know, but all, the woman who was running for Congress on the GOP ticket, who was the adjutant general of the State National Guard, she had said 2 months before when she launched her campaign, what so many people, I'm not sure that global warming is real, more research needs to be done. The more research that needed to be done was, how many people will walk across Vermont and ask me to change my mind, okay? And the empirical answer was 1,000 is enough because she signed, okay? It was very useful for us. This was back this was back pre-Barack, so we were all still cynical about politics and things. It was very good for us to see the system work kind of the way that it was supposed to, all right? The only bummer was to open the newspaper the next morning, and there's this story that says that this 1,000 people might have represented the largest demonstration about climate change that had yet taken place in the United States. Again, all of a sudden, no wonder we're not doing so well here, you know? I mean, it's true that we have economists and scientists and politicians, wonderful leaders like Al Gore, on and on and on, okay? We've got all the things you need for a movement. We just forgot the movement part, you know? Something to give it some heft and weight, all right? So we started thinking, well, maybe can we do this outside the confines of funky Vermont? And how would we, when I say we, I mean me and 6 students at Middlebury College, 6 seniors, okay? They weren't done with school, but they were done with school. So they were ready to work, you know? And we didn't have any money. We didn't have any organization. We just started sending out emails to people in January of 2007 saying, will you hold a rally with this same 80% demand where you are, okay, in April 14th. We secretly hoped that we didn't tell anyone for fear of humiliation that we would organize 100 of these things, and that would have been 100 more. Turned out, as Steve said in the introduction, the thing just took off like a virus. It turned out there were lots of people around the country who had cottoned on to the essential truth that climate change was incredibly dangerous, and who had also cottoned on to the essential truth that we were not going to solve it one light bulb at a time, okay? These people had already changed their light bulbs. They had already, you know, started taking the bus. They were already eating local food, already doing the sort of things, but you know, they were able to do math, too, at least in some visceral level, and realized that that was not change on the scale that in the time we had was going to do anything about actually changing the atmospheric concentration of CO2. And so they were willing to engage also, along with all those other good things, in this kind of symbolic political action. And on that day, it was quite amazing. We'd rented a hall in D.C., and gotten as many politicians as we could corral in to watch. And we just we set up the computer on a big, huge screen, and people were uploading images from, there's rallies all across the country, and we were just sort of feeding them raw feed onto the wall. And they were coming in at times like 10 and 20 a minute from around America, and they were unbelievably beautiful to see. And we'd realized that our complete lack of resources and organizing skill had actually allowed something beautiful to happen. Instead of having like a big march on Washington, which would have been a little strange anyway to tell everybody to drive across America to, you know, protest global warming, we'd had something that was in certain ways much sweeter than that. You know, people in their own communities figuring out how to get this message. So Key West, Florida, the only coral reefs in the U.S., you know, coral reefs, an ecosystem, a corner of God's brain that will be gone by mid-century unless we make very big changes, okay? They did an underwater demonstration. They got all these people in scuba gear, and they took their signs underwater, 80% by 20, and big fish swimming through on the video. I mean, it's like interspecies political action. It's very cool. And a little further up the coast, I've never been to Jacksonville, Florida. My sense is that it's different from Vermont, and the they chose their place, the parking lot of the NFL football stadium, okay? Because in the fall, I think that's sort of where community, big tailgates and things. This was the spring. Somebody brings a yacht there. Somebody else rents a crane. They winch this yacht 20 foot up in the air, and then someone said, like, ahoy, when Greenland slides into the ocean, there the ocean will be, and you can just hear, okay, I get it. I was in Lower Manhattan, and there were thousands of people, thousands of us in blue shirts that morning, everybody holding hands, this like human tide line, okay? New Yorkers tend to view the world, at least in part, through the real estate lens. We wished to show which real estate was going to be underwater before long. It was all across the country, in churches, in farm fields, in city halls. It was very, very beautiful and effective. 3 days later, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama changed their environment and energy policies dramatically and endorsed this 80% by 2050 cuts, okay? And now you see Obama refer to it all the time, and we see it in the congressional legislation that was introduced by Ed Markey and Henry Waxman day before yesterday. It was quite nice to be able to play a small part in that transition. In fact, you could say that we were feeling very good about ourselves in the wake. I think the technical term would be smug in the wake of this, which is why it was quite disappointing 6 weeks later when the Arctic began to melt, okay, and melt very quickly. And we really were forced to realize that, in fact, even 80% cuts by 2050 don't come close to what we need. We need much more speedy action than that. And more importantly, that we need to figure out how to do this on a global scale very fast. This is the ultimate in global, I don't call it global warming for nothing, okay? And then we had this number to use as a kind of tool in this organizing project. And so about a year ago, we formed this thing called 350.org, okay? Knowing that in December of this year, in Copenhagen, the world's leaders will meet and come up with the next big treaty on carbon. We used to think it would be an evolutionary document that would expand the Kyoto Accords some and include more. Now we know it has to be, given the science, a really transformative agreement. It has to not just be some agreement. They'll agree on something. You don't get 880 heads of state in one place and say we failed. They'll agree. But what we need is an agreement that actually gets us towards stability, that takes that number seriously. So we've spent the last year at 350.org spreading that, building a kind of networks around the world, wonderful, helping find and identify and work with wonderful networks like the India Youth Climate Network or many others all over the world, and starting some in places where there hasn't been this kind of thing before. We now have offices or sort of, we work with young people. Most of my colleagues are all 23, so office is sometimes a sort of grand construction, but we have, hubs of activity in Beirut and in Johannesburg and in Budapest and in Delhi and in Quito and, and in San Francisco and Washington. And we've spent that year very profitably getting this out into the bloodstream of the kind of climate community, okay? Moving them some of the direction. So when Al Gore went to speak at the last big international negotiations in Poland in December, he gave the last speech of the week, and he gave his very good standard talk, and at a certain point, because we talked with him a lot, he said, and just as an aside, he said, and you know what, the old targets aren't good enough, we have to get to 350, and the place just erupted. There's like a minute of applause, and Al Gore sort of, looking a little puzzled about why this is happening. We talked about it later, said, yeah, that was pretty amazing. What had happened was that, we'd spread the word effectively enough around that people understood that this represented a real change. This year, before Copenhagen, we now have to take the next step and make that into a very public movement, and that is where I need your help, okay? As far as I can tell, no use just talking about this stuff unless one intends on doing something about it. October 24th is the day we've picked for a day of global action on 350, okay? Because it's about 6 weeks before Copenhagen, and we need to take that most important number and make it the most visible number in the world. And there are going to be thousands of actions that day. We sent out the first letter about this 2 days ago out around the web, and we've already got I've 200 and some registered actions in 25 countries. I mean, that'll grow exponentially as the weeks go on if you guys help. There are going to be people high up in the Himalayas with banners. There's going to be 350 scuba divers on the Great Barrier Reef. We just found out that there's going to be a research team on Easter Island, and they're going to string banners from the noses of those stone gentlemen, you know, on and on and on. I need from you guys two things. One, to organize some of those sort of things where you are, okay? Here in New Haven or wherever you're from, or through whatever groups and communities you belong to. For instance, around the country, churches are starting to prepare to ring their bells 350 times on that day, okay? Which is a very good idea because it turns out no TV or radio reporter can resist coming to look when that happens, you know? It's a good story, and you have to explain it to the parish, and you have to explain it to the neighbors, and on and on and on. You all have some overlapping, interesting sets of identities, and I need you to start thinking about how to take those communities and put them to work. And I need one other thing. We're going to, look, the odds on this fight are not especially good, it must be said, okay? The physical momentum of the planet's strong, and the other side is extremely strong. ExxonMobil made more money last year than any company in the history of money, okay? We don't have money as a tool. We could pool what is left of our 401ks and be somewhat still less than ExxonMobil, you know, has, all right? We do have one possibility, one wild card, okay? And that's actually introduced by this technology that has spread in the last 15 or 20 years. If the Internet came into being for a reason, it was to help right now, right here, okay? If we took this is an interesting and diverse crew. If we took your email address books, okay, and you all forwarded this message that we have up on the 350.org website, this letter, to 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 people with a little note from yourself at the top of each one saying why you thought it was important, okay, well, not everybody who got it would open it, not everyone who act on it, but if 10% of them did and then they forwarded it, we'd be halfway around the world before we knew it, all right? That's the only possibility we have, is that kind of virality, and it is incredibly beautiful to watch it happen. I cannot tell you how moving it is to open the email in the morning, as I did the other morning, and there's a picture from the Cameroon in West Africa. Okay? Not a place where they have internet connection, but in the third world now, every place people have cell phones, and people know how to use them the way that we use the net. Okay, you can push text and images. Our 90-second wordless animation has been seen tens of millions of times now around the world, including a lot on little tiny cell phone screens. Okay, well, this guy, this farmer there, had heard about this and understood it, and he and his neighbors planted 350 trees on the edge of their village and hung a little sign with this logo on it and took a picture of it with the cell phone and sent it to us. And I damn near cried when I saw it because, A, you know for damn sure that nobody in the Cameroon is causing global warming. Okay? Not their fault. But also, B, they realize that they can be some part of the solution to it, you know? That this really is a world and that they're going to take some responsibility we haven't taken to try to make something happen. The other day we got pictures from Ladakh, a small kingdom high up in the mountains in the Himalayas. Not, I think, very many Methodists in Ladakh. It's Buddhists there, and the Buddhist Association had heard about this because a young person from the United States had been there to visit and told them about it, and they got very interested, and they convened this day-long outdoor meeting, and there were 1,500 people at it, which turns out to be the equivalent, given the population, of having like 5 million people on the mall in Washington, okay? And they listened all day. Apparently a 94-year-old man got up and gave a long disquisition on how the weather had changed in the course of his life, and everybody understood because the darn glaciers are melting around him. And at the end of the day, these 1,500 people, many of them monks and nuns, formed this big human 350, the mountains in the backdrop, an unbelievably beautiful picture. That's what I need you guys to figure out how to do. We don't have, if I've given even the slightest impression that we're a highly organized organization, I take it back, you know. There were, anyway, a year ago when we started this, 6 of us working full-time on this, which meant that each had a continent of their own, okay? Not going to happen if I have to organize. You have to organize it and figure out how to push it and just take it and run with it. It's like a potluck dinner. All we're telling you is $3.50 and October 24th, and the rest is up to you. I'm going to finish just by, I've spoken completely frankly so far, and I'm going to finish by speaking completely frankly. There's absolutely no guarantee that this strategy will work. In fact, there's absolutely no guarantee any strategy will work. It is possible that we have waited too long to get started. There are scientists who say the physical momentum of these systems is great enough that it's too late to meaningfully arrest them, and we're going to see. The best science indicates that there is still a window of opportunity, albeit a narrow one, albeit closing. All right? Rajendra Pachauri, the Indian-born head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who accepted the Nobel alongside Gore, said recently, as far as he could tell from reading the data that they're getting, that if we haven't made fundamental changes in, at least begun to make very fundamental changes in our energy system by 2012, okay, the momentum of these things will be too great. Kids who entered Yale College in last fall are going to be still in school in 2012, okay? It doesn't do any good to wait until you get out of college to do something about this, you know? It doesn't do any good to wait at all. And that's the thing that makes it different from any kind of movement that we've had to build before. I was thinking about this recently because, of course, we've just come through the year of the 40th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. And so they showed off in that incredible speech that Dr. King gave the night before he was shot, that sermon in the church in Memphis. And he said, I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the problem. I don't know if I'm going to get there with you, but I know you will get there. And, of course, he didn't get there with him. He got gunned down the next day. Nobody has to, we don't have to be as brave as people in the civil rights movement, okay? No one's going to shoot you for talking about global warming. But they had one luxury that we didn't, which was that absolute assurance that however long it took, they would win. Reverend King always said at the end of speeches, quoting from the New England abolitionist Theodore Parker, Reverend Theodore Parker, always said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We're going to win in the... It's a trope that Obama picked up on in his inaugural address. Arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat. And if we do not very quickly figure out how to get this under control, then we won't. It comes with a time limit. That's the bad news. The good news is that all over the world, people are beginning to figure that out and beginning to step up. And much of it's coming from young people, but it can't come from young people alone. It needs to come from every kind of people. And you have it within you to help enormously in that process. And I hope very, very much that you will. And I thank you in advance for it. Thank you.
We'll have a chance for some questions, but before we do, there's a presentation. Oh, it's going to be later? Pardon me. In that case, questions, and I'll ask if you'll field your
Absolutely. And comments or abuse or ideas or whatever is.
Nice to see you again. I have two quick questions.
Yes.
One is, there seems to be kind of CO2 limit fatigue, because your demand in 2007 was 80% reduction below Oh, sorry. Should I start over? What you were talking about in 2007 was 80% reduction by 2050, below 1990 levels. And I believe that a lot of people are talking now about reducing things below 2005 levels, which is a huge difference. And so I'd like you to comment on that. And I know some of the current legislation, I don't think, talks about 1990 levels. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is Tim DeChristopher, who you may know of, is a University of Utah student who fraudulently bid, sorry, that's what I meant, on oil and gas leases, specifically, with no intention of paying for them, specifically because he thought it would destroy a beautiful part of the world and specifically lead to a lot of global warming. Right after that, Ken Salazar, the new head of the Department of the Interior, basically nullified all of them, saying basically what Tim DeChristopher had said, but the Obama administration is still pursuing charges against him, which could result in 10 years in jail. So I wanted to know what you think about taking more radical action to save the planet.
Sure. This Tim DeChristopher story is a great story, a really wonderful young man who figured out, sort of almost on the spur of the moment, this quite inventive strategy to disrupt the completely absurd sale of oil and gas leases on the edge of national parks and things like that. He won, they had this auction, Conoco and Chevron and stuff, and this guy was just sitting in the front bidding, and he won like dozens of these patches, but he didn't obviously have any money to pay for them, but it sort of threw a monkey wrench, as it were, into the whole thing. And as you point out, the Obama administration, as soon as it got in, overturned these sales. It's not the Obama administration that's indicting him. It's the leftover U.S. attorney from the Bush administration in Utah, who's apparently getting ready to run for Congress and determined to make a name for himself on this guy. I saw Tim, and this goes to your question about more radical action, saw Tim in D.C. 3 weeks ago, where we did this protest. You all must know Wendell Berry, the great Kentucky farmer and author, and I think the finest writer at work in our country today. And he and I had sent out a letter asking people to come to D.C. for civil disobedience outside. It turns out the Congress operates its own coal-fired power plant 2 blocks from Capitol Hill for 103 years. It's been burning coal. It's in complete violation of the Clean Air Act and everything else. But so we asked people to come join. Well, Tim was one of the people who came. It was a beautiful, great, inspiring day. We all, I had Wendell Berry on one arm and Jim Hansen on the other, and there was Terry Tempest Williams, and all kinds of other people. We were all down there illegally. Well, the police, so many people showed up that the police decided not to arrest anyone because they couldn't deal with the number of people that showed up. And Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid announced that they were going to stop burning coal in this power plant and start burning something else, So it was a pretty cool day, and a validation of this, that we might need more, not more radical action, more all kinds of creative action. One of the things to make sure you get your head around in this global warming debate, by the way, is the meaning of that word radical. All right? What's radical, almost inconceivably radical, is pouring more carbon into the atmosphere and just seeing what happens, okay? Melting the Arctic is about as radical an act as you could think of, all right? And frankly, those of us who are fighting it are profoundly conservative in every meaningful sense of that word, all right? I mean, the basic argument is, this worked reasonably well for 10,000 years. Let's see if we can keep it going a little longer, all right? That's a conservative principle if there ever was one. I think at the moment what we most need is this kind of symbolic action of the type that we're talking about at 350, all right? We're not going to close down one by one all the coal plants in the country and then in the world in time enough to make a difference. Our hope for making a palpable difference in the amount of carbon that goes into the atmosphere is reaching national and then global agreements to put stiff caps on carbon and begin to ratchet those caps down. That's the only place we have where there's enough leverage to actually move things quickly. That's why this kind of action that we're doing, this sort of globally coordinated thing at 350, potentially is very useful. It sets a bar for those negotiators as they arrive in Copenhagen. It focuses somehow getting a hold of the imagination of the world is the most important thing. If you can do that, if you can get people understanding, thinking along the same particular line, not that we need to do something about the environment, but that this is how the world works, that's as much carbon as we can have, then you can bend that perception will then work to one degree or another to really bend the politics. That's got to be the hope anyway. Oh, a question about CO2 levels in 1990 and 2005. And yeah, this stuff shifts all the time. It's not worrying about the exact target that you're aiming for at any particular moment is not the key question. It's can we get huge action started on climate, okay? Because even the most ambitious numbers that we talk about probably aren't enough to do what needs to be done. What we need to do is get this process going in a big way fast and then see how much we can speed it up along the way, okay? So, and for that, the most useful thing is to have a real goal in mind, and that goal has to be to bring the carbon concentration of the atmosphere back. Now that's, it's going to be, the youngest people in this room will be elderly before that happens under the best of circumstances, okay? But if we don't start now, then no one will ever see that concentration again because the momentum will get too strong. That's why we have to start now. I've gone on too long.
Here's one back here, and then one over here.
Yes.
May I ask?
And I'll try to answer.
If you keep your questions brief and focused, that'll help.
It's all rattle on, and that's the real problem here. I understand.
Hi, I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Please.
So, if humans are good at anything, it's adapting. If we can have a green revolution, if China can rebuild its economy in 30 years, we will figure this out one way or another. I mean, Obama right now is at G20 saying, U.S. is going to take leadership. We have all these great activists running around. Why should I care?
Okay. Very good question and defines where most people are. The first thing to understand is that there are limits to adaptation, okay? And we're now pushing those limits of adaptation hard. And we're quite adaptable, but we're, think about Bangladesh just as a proxy for thousands of other places around the world, okay? Try to imagine what adaptation might mean when sea level has risen a couple of feet and there's no water coming down from the Himalayas. Everybody who models the scenario says what it means is 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 million people trying to find someplace else to live, okay? Well, try to model that adaptation, because human beings do move. Where are they planning to move? India's next door. It's really not like India has, just a vast, unexplored frontier, to just pour people into. In fact, India is finishing building this year a 2,500-mile-long wall modeled on the one between Israel and the West Bank, electrified in portions between India and Bangladesh, precisely to keep people from coming across it, okay? Think about adaptation to an ocean where the pH has changed from 8.2 to 8.1 in the last decade or so, all right? Becoming steadily more acidic and already reaching the point where the small animals that make up the single biggest part of the world's biomass are unable to form their shells in that acid environment. Think about adaptation in a place like California. Stephen Chu, the new energy secretary, a Nobelist in physics, okay, went to his native California he gave his first interview since taking office. And since he's a scientist by training, he hasn't yet, and hopefully never will, learn the, political art of pulling his punches, What he said in the interview with the Los Angeles Times was, I don't think you guys have quite understood in your gut what's going on, he said. The modeling shows that unless we make big changes, by later in this century, there will be no snowpack left in the Sierras, at which point there'll be no agriculture in California, and I'm not sure you'll be able to live in the big cities either. Okay? The point I'm trying to make is there are limits to adaptability. Given very long time, you can adapt to a lot, right? The oceans rise and fall over deep time. And against that, an increase in sea level of a foot doesn't, say, oh, well, we can, I don't know. An increase in sea level on the East Coast, where most beaches slope inward at 1 degree, 1 foot more ocean brings the water 90 feet further in, There comes a point, and it's not that far away, at which it's very difficult to do. I mean, the U.S. government, even in the Bush administration, published a study last year saying that a 2-foot rise in sea level would mean that you'd have to rebuild or move all the airports, or most of the airports on the eastern seaboard, on and on and on. One of the ways to understand this is that there's not enough money in the world to adapt to the kind of changes that are coming, all right? We're getting used to tossing around trillion-dollar figures, okay? There's a lot more trillions out there to toss around. I mean, one hurricane across one relatively small area, New Orleans and coastal Mississippi, so far it's taken about $140 billion to fix, and those of you who've been down there know that it's far from fixed at that price, So it's very important to figure out how to adapt to that which we can't stop. But we've got to keep things, all the things that I've described today, remember, this is maybe the most useful statistic to keep in mind. All the changes that I've described today, the Arctic melting, that's with a 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in global average temperature from 59 to 60 degrees. The consensus estimate, by no means the worst case estimate, by this point, in fact, even a conservative one, is that by the end of this century, unless we do dramatic things, we will have raised the temperature 5 degrees further from what it is now. Okay? And you don't just get to multiply by 5 the kind of damage we're seeing, because what we're now understanding is that the planet works at threshold steps, and you go past a certain one of them, and big things, it's not a smooth linear acceleration. So I got to say, the most important adaptation that we need to make is to get off fossil fuel as fast as we can so that we don't make this problem any worse than it already is. Believe me, there's already more than enough to adapt to coming down the pipeline.
Over here.
Hi, I was one of the students there with you, Bill, at the protest, and one of a number of students who, since that protest, have been starting to organize in New Haven. So just a plug for this, that if we're talking about radical creative action here in New Haven, there are a number of us students from the Forestry and Divinity School and other people that are interested in doing this and are forming a group. So if you'd like to, I'll be back here after the talk, and please come and see me and leave an email.
But not radical, conservative creative action that you're undertaking here.
Well, that's part of the question.
New Haven.
I'm not sure that anyone would get it. My email address is jhaheim@gmail.com. It's JHAAHEIM as in Mary @gmail. But I will be back here the whole time, so please come back and see me. Part of my question then, Bill, is it sounds like you are, and I tend to be after hearing all this sort of thing, pretty outraged. We have, this is a Earth Care Week around the Divinity School, and we have a sign over there that says, "Where is the outrage?" So amidst peaceful protests on October 24th with 350s, where do you see in this movement, in this year, coming up to Copenhagen, the place of outrage, and how can that be channeled effectively into something that'll mean something by the time we get to December?
The only thing I would say is everybody on the one hand is outraged, and the question is exactly as you put it, is figuring out what do we do at any given moment that's the most effective use of that outrage, passion, anger and also joy and hope and love, you know, because those are at least as important. One of the things that we need to do is deploy that outrage as effectively as possible, okay? One of the best things about this thing we did in D.C., when Wendell Berry and I had been planning it, one of the things we told everybody is if you want to come get arrested, you have to come wearing your, you know, Sunday best or whatever, okay? Because, A, we wanted to point out that we were not strange radical force, that we were very, in a certain sense, a very conservative one. And B, because there's always the danger in this kind of work that there'll be a kind of just unhinged anger and whatever that takes over, and people protesting in ways that the rest of the world can't understand and doesn't make sense, you know. And we saw some of that in London, you know. I don't think anybody can really explain exactly what everybody was rampaging around London about, those people who were protesting the last few days, and it completely got overwhelmed by the much more positive pictures of, you know, Michelle, bless her heart, with, you know, young school kids and things, you know. I mean, it was very cool. This question of what's most effective haunts me all the time. I think, as you can tell from where I'm spending my work, though I will continue to work on civil disobedience stuff and things when it's appropriate, I think the thing for the moment, for this year, is this very insistent symbolic action that we take seriously the science. There are exceptions to that, and there are people organizing wonderful stuff, among other things, in the coal fields of West Virginia and Kentucky. Global warming, I mean, if you want to see a vision of hell, visit mountaintop removal zones of the southern Appalachians, you know, where the coal that we use to power our lives is literally, I mean, when they say mountaintop removal, it's exactly what they mean, you know. They are, in fact, one of my favorite, there was a guy down there, a pastor, who was sort of heading some of the opposition to this. And you know those church signs they have in rural areas where you change the letters in front every week and you put some corny... One week he put up a sign that said, God was wrong, support mountaintop removal. You know, I mean, it's beyond belief, the scale of devastation. And so I'm going down there to help people work on that and things. But I think in our communities right now, most important thing is to take that message and virally spread it as far as we can. And, you know, it's going to happen or not going to happen based in part on the ability of people who are, especially people who are talented using these new tools that we have to spread that stuff. All of you who know how to use email are extremely powerful at this point. That's our odd new invention, okay? And people who are good at political action over the years have always taken advantage of new inventions. Television, when it came into being, was the thing that allowed Dr. King to do much of what he did, you know, on and on and on. This is our wild card.
I think we've got time for one more, if it's quick, if there's someone. Mary Evelyn?
Bill, I just want to thank you, of course, for your amazing work for so long, and I just want to add to what the students are thinking about, and that is that the Forum on Religion and Ecology is completely with you. We do have 8,000 people on this list. It's international, and we will help your wonderful bloodstream. But I also just want to say that the website is based here at Yale, and we are putting up on the website all of the major statements of the world's religions on climate change. And I think our call is to call them to action. Many terrific statements have been made by the world's religions, but we will certainly help you.
And this is, Mary Evelyn, thank you so much for that. If there's any person in the world who's going to be able to leverage the faith communities of the world behind this action, it's Mary Evelyn and John, who have done unbelievable work over the years on all of that. And what you said at the end is absolutely right. You know, every denomination that we can think of now has passed some kind of resolution saying we believe in stewarding God's creation and, you know, yada, yada. You know, And maybe they've even gone and changed some of the light bulbs in the sanctuary, okay? It's not working, and the time has come to everybody, for each of us to sort of call our own bluffs on this and say, okay, now where am I ready to go? It's funny, I was speaking last night at Mount Holyoke College, and I was in a room of undergraduates, okay? And I was thinking, it just sort of struck me, because I've been thinking a lot about the civil rights movement stuff, that these were, 50 years ago in that same room, there doubtless were young women sitting there trying to figure out if they were going to get on the bus to go to Alabama or Mississippi or whatever it was, and whether they had the courage and the willingness to set aside some of the sort of path in front of them for a while or whatever else to make that happen, okay? And they were, along with the people who did far more in the South to begin with, they were among the reasons that we were able to, in the 1960s, see such a great change in consciousness. A change in consciousness that continues to bear fruit. Absent that movement, no Barack Obama in, 2009. That's the kind of moment that we're at. They don't come along all that often, and it's kind of a pain when they do, because people who know about things become morally obliged to do something about them, and if they don't, then there's a kind of rot that sets in. And I really look forward to working with all of you on this going forward. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.